At 25,000 feet over Nazi Germany, First Lieutenant William Lawley's heart stopped beating. A 20-millimeter cannon shell had just exploded in his cockpit. The explosion was so violent it shattered every instrument on the panel. His co-pilot was dead, killed instantly, slumped over the controls with blood pooling beneath him. Shrapnel had torn through Lawley's face, his hands, his chest. Blood was pouring down his flight suit, freezing almost instantly in the negative 40-degree air, and his B-17, with 10 men aboard, was diving straight toward the ground. The bombardier, Lieutenant Henry Mason, felt the aircraft pitch forward violently. He was thrown against the ceiling as the aircraft pitched forward. He knew immediately that something catastrophic had happened in the cockpit above him. He crawled through the narrow tunnel, connecting the nose to the flight deck, and found a nightmare. Murphy was dead. Lawley appeared dead too, slumped over, covered in blood, eyes closed, not moving. Blood was everywhere, on the controls, on the windows, on the instruments, dripping onto the floor. The wind was screaming through the shattered windscreen at 300 miles per hour. And through that broken glass, Mason could see the ground spinning closer and closer. He grabbed Lawley and checked for a pulse. Nothing. He checked for breathing. Nothing. The pilot's skin was cold. His eyes were closed. His chest wasn't moving. For what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only seconds, the pilot of Cabin in the Sky was clinically dead. Then Mason did something desperate. He slapped Lawley across the face, once, twice, 3 times. He poured water on him from a canteen. He shook him violently, screaming his name over the roar of the wind. Nothing. He slapped him again, harder. He grabbed his flight jacket and shook him like a rag doll. And then, impossibly, Lawley's eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, rolling in his head like a man waking from deep anesthesia. Then they locked onto the spinning horizon through the shattered windscreen. Lawley's mangled hands found the control column, and he said 3 words that Mason would remember for the rest of his life. "I've got it." For the next 2.5 hours, a man who had been dead would fly a crippled bomber through enemy territory, fight off 8 more fighter attacks, and bring 9 men home. This is the story of the pilot who died at 25,000 feet and refused to stay dead. And before I tell you how William Lawley survived the impossible, you need to understand what was trying to kill him. At 25,000 feet, the air temperature is negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That's cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes. That's cold enough to turn the blood on your face into red ice. At that altitude, the oxygen level is less than half what it is at sea level. Without supplemental oxygen, a person loses consciousness in about 30 seconds. Brain damage begins within 2 minutes. And here's what happens when you add blood loss to that equation. When a human body loses blood, it goes into a state called hypovolemic shock. The heart races frantically, trying to pump what little blood remains to the vital organs. The body pulls blood away from the extremities, fingers, toes, arms, legs, and concentrates it around the vital organs. The brain, the heart, the lungs, everything else becomes expendable. At sea level, losing 1/3 of your blood is often fatal. At 25,000 feet, with thin air and freezing temperatures, it's almost always fatal. The math simply doesn't work. But here's the paradox that saved William Lawley's life. The same cold that was trying to freeze him was also preserving him. When the human body drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, it enters a state called hypothermia. The metabolism slows dramatically. The brain requires less oxygen. The heart can stop beating, and the brain can survive, if it's cold enough. In modern hospitals, cardiac surgeons use this principle deliberately. They cool patients' bodies before major heart surgeries, stopping the heart for 30 minutes or more. Knowing the cold will preserve brain function, until they can restart it. In 1944, no one understood this science, but in the cockpit of a B-17 at 25,000 feet, nature was performing the same procedure accidentally. Lieutenant Lawley's wounds were severe. His blood loss was massive. But the frozen air of the stratosphere put his body into a state of suspended animation, slowing his metabolism, just enough to keep his brain alive while his heart struggled to beat. He wasn't quite dead, but he wasn't really alive either. He was somewhere in between, waiting for a reason to come back. William Richmond Lawley Jr. was born in Leeds, Alabama, on August 23, 1920. Leeds was a small town outside Birmingham, the kind of place where the biggest employer was the steel mills and the biggest dream most kids had was getting out. And Lawley got out by learning to fly. He joined the Army Air Corps in 1942, right after Pearl Harbor. He was 21 years old, just a kid by any reasonable standard, but old enough to fight, old enough to fly, old enough to die. He was good at everything the Army threw at him, good enough to be selected for pilot training when most applicants washed out, good enough to be assigned to the B-17 Flying Fortress, the most important bomber in the American arsenal, good enough to be made an aircraft commander, with 10 men's lives depending on his decisions. By February 1944, Lieutenant Lawley was stationed at Chelmsford, England, with the 305th Bomb Group. He had already flown more than a dozen missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. He had watched bombers explode in midair around him. He had seen friends die in burning aircraft falling from the sky. He had landed with dead men in his crew and holes in his wings. He was 23 years old, and he was already a veteran of 100 near-death experiences. His crew called him the Old Man, not because of his age, but because of his steadiness under fire. When flak was bursting and fighters were swarming, Lawley never panicked. He never raised his voice. He just flew the airplane. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant Paul Murphy, a quiet kid from Ohio who played piano and wrote letters to his mother every single day. Murphy was on his 8th mission. He was finally starting to believe he might actually survive the war. He was starting to make plans for what he'd do when he got home. He wouldn't get home. February 20th, 1944. The target was Leipzig. The 8th Air Force called this week Big Week, officially known as Operation Argument. It was the most intensive strategic bombing campaign against Germany ever attempted. The goal was brutally simple: destroy the factories that built German fighter planes. If they could cripple fighter production, the Allies would control the skies over Europe. Leipzig was home to the Messerschmitt factories, the heart of German fighter production. It was one of the most heavily defended cities in Nazi Germany. Over 200 anti-aircraft guns ringed the factory complex. For the bomber crews, Leipzig was a death sentence with wings. The briefing rooms went silent when the curtain was pulled back and the red yarn led to Leipzig. Men wrote final letters to their families. Some prayed, some threw up. That morning, the 8th Air Force launched over 1,000 bombers toward Germany. 21 of them would not come home. 3 of those lost bombers would be from the 305th Bomb Group alone. Cabin in the Sky took off from Chelmsford at 8:30, climbing slowly into the gray English sky. The formation crossed into German airspace at 10:45. By 11:30, they could see Leipzig on the horizon, and the sky around it was already turning black with flak. Lawley's aircraft made it through the initial barrage. They dropped their bombs on the target. They watched secondary explosions erupt below them. They turned for home, 350 miles away. They had done their job. Now they just had to survive the return trip. And then the fighters came. The Focke-Wulf 190 came out of the sun at 400 miles per hour. It was a head-on attack. The most devastating approach because the bombers' nose guns had the smallest field of fire. By the time the gunners could track the fighter, it was already past them. But not before it fired. A 20-millimeter cannon shell weighs about half a pound. It travels at 2,500 feet per second. When it explodes, it sends hundreds of fragments in every direction. One shell exploded directly in the cockpit of Cabin in the Sky. Co-pilot Paul Murphy never knew what hit him. The shell detonated inches from his head. He was killed instantly, slumped over the control column. Lieutenant Lawley took fragments to the face, both hands and torso. His oxygen mask was torn away. Blood poured into his eyes, blinding him. His hands, the hands he needed to fly the airplane, were shredded, and then he lost consciousness. With Murphy dead and Lawley unconscious, there was no one flying the B-17. The aircraft rolled into a steep dive, plummeting toward Germany at over 300 miles per hour. In the nose compartment, Bombardier Lieutenant Henry Mason felt the dive begin. He was thrown against the ceiling as the aircraft pitched forward. He knew immediately what had happened. He crawled through the tunnel into the cockpit and found a nightmare. Murphy was dead. Lawley appeared dead. Blood was everywhere, on the controls, on the windows, on the instruments. The wind was screaming through the shattered windscreen, and the ground was coming up fast. Mason had no flight training. He knew the basics of keeping a plane level, but he had never landed a B-17. If Lawley was dead, they were all dead. He pulled Murphy's body off the controls. The aircraft was still diving. He grabbed Lawley's shoulder and shook him. Nothing. He checked for a pulse. He couldn't find one, but his hands were shaking so badly he wasn't sure. He slapped Lawley across the face. Nothing. He slapped him again, harder. Nothing. He found a water bottle and poured it on Lawley's face, washing away some of the blood. And then, impossibly, Lawley's eyes opened. They were unfocused at first. Then they locked onto the spinning horizon through the windscreen. Lawley's mangled hands found the control column. "I've got it." That was all he said. 3 words. Then he pulled back on the controls and began the fight to save his crew. The B-17 leveled out at approximately 12,000 feet. They had fallen nearly 13,000 feet in less than 2 minutes. They were deep in Germany, trailing smoke, with 2 engines gone and a dead man in the right seat. And they were 350 miles from England. For the next 2.5 hours, William Lawley flew a crippled bomber through the most dangerous airspace in the world. His wounds were severe. Blood continued to pour from his face and hands. He could only see out of one eye. The other was sealed shut with dried blood. His co-pilot was dead beside him. His crew was wounded. His aircraft was falling apart, but he refused to give up. When more fighters appeared, Lawley coordinated the defensive fire, calling out positions to his gunners. When the number 3 engine caught fire, he ordered it feathered and compensated for the asymmetric thrust. When the intercom failed, he sent crewmen crawling through the aircraft to relay orders. Twice during the flight, your crew members asked permission to bail out. Lawley refused. "Dempsey and Peterson can't jump," he said. The flight engineer and ball turret gunner were too badly wounded to survive a parachute landing. "If they stay, I stay." He could have saved himself. No one would have blamed him. A man with his wounds had every right to bail out and take his chances. Instead, he chose to risk his life for men who couldn't save themselves. That's what heroes do. By the time Cabin in the Sky reached the English coast, Lawley was operating on adrenaline and willpower alone. His blood loss was critical. His vision was fading. His hands were so damaged that he was essentially flying by feel, his shredded fingers barely able to grip the controls. And then came the final problem. The landing gear wouldn't extend. The hydraulic system had been damaged in the attack. The wheels were stuck in the up position. They could try to crank them down manually, but that would take time they didn't have. Lawley made a decision. They would belly land. A belly landing in a B-17 is survivable if done correctly. The aircraft slides on its belly like a sled, the friction slowing it gradually. But if the plane catches a wing or spins, it will cartwheel, and everyone aboard will die. Lawley found RAF Red Hill, a small airfield south of London. He lined up on the runway. He told his crew to assume crash positions, and then he set her down. Cabin in the sky hit the runway at 110 miles per hour. Sparks flew as metal scraped concrete. The aircraft slid for nearly 1,000 feet, shedding pieces as it went. But it stayed straight. It stayed intact. When it finally stopped, Lawley didn't move. Ground crews rushed to the aircraft, expecting to find dead men. Instead, they found 9 wounded survivors, and a pilot who had just flown for 2.5 hours with wounds that should have killed him in minutes. Lawley refused medical attention until every member of his crew had been evacuated. Only when he was certain they were safe did he allow the medics to take him. He collapsed on the stretcher. He had lost over 1/3 of his blood. His heart was barely beating. He had been dying for 2.5 hours. He just hadn't let it stop him. William Lawley spent 6 weeks in the hospital. The doctors said it was a miracle he survived. Not just the crash, not just the flight, but the initial attack. By any medical standard, he should have died in that cockpit. He didn't care about medical standards. He only cared that his crew was alive. On August 8, 1944, Lieutenant William Lawley received the Medal of Honor from President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The citation mentioned his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. But Lawley never called himself a hero. In every interview for the rest of his life, he said the same thing. I just did what any pilot would do. The crew needed me. That was all that mattered. He lived until 1999. He raised a family. He ran a business. He never forgot the men who flew with him that day, or the co-pilot who didn't come home. Henry Mason, the bombardier who revived him, stayed in touch until Lawley's death. They never talked much about what happened in that cockpit. They didn't need to. They both knew. Some things don't need words. Looking back with modern medical knowledge, we can understand what saved William Lawley. When that 20-millimeter shell exploded in the cockpit, his body went into profound shock. His blood pressure dropped. His heart struggled to pump. To an observer like Henry Mason, he appeared dead, but he wasn't. The extreme cold of the cockpit at 25,000 feet slowed his metabolism to a crawl. His brain, starved of oxygen, entered a state of hibernation rather than death. His heart, weakened by blood loss, continued to beat, but so faintly that it was undetectable by touch. When Mason slapped him, shook him, poured water on his face, he triggered a response. Adrenaline flooded Lawley's system. His blood pressure spiked. His heart found its rhythm again, and his will to live did the rest. Scientists call this phenomenon cold preservation. In hospitals, they use it deliberately. In the cockpit of a B-17, it happened by accident. But in the end, science can only explain so much. The rest was pure human determination. A man who refused to let death take him because other men needed him alive. That's not medicine. That's not physics. That's courage. On February 20th, 1944, Lieutenant William Lawley was dead for a period that felt like an eternity to the men trying to revive him. Then he opened his eyes, he took the controls, and he flew a crippled bomber 350 miles through enemy territory, fighting off attacks, bleeding from a dozen wounds, with one engine on fire and his co-pilot dead beside him. He landed that aircraft. He saved 9 lives, and he did it while his body was trying to die around him. When they asked him how, he never had a complicated answer. "The crew needed me," he said. "So I flew." William Lawley was dead for 4 minutes. Then he flew the plane home. That's not a story about medicine. That's not a story about luck. That's a story about what human beings can do when failure is not an option. If you found this story incredible, you should see what happened when a B-17 Ball turret gunner fell 22,000 feet without a parachute and walked away. That video is right here. I'll see you there.